Okay, we're up to Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. We're 6 lines into the page. So we had a machlokes, a discussion between Rabbi and Rish Lakish, at least who they were quoting, as to whether yeshna l'shchita metchila bad soif or ein shchita el b'soif, which means, let's say someone takes 10 seconds to shecht an animal, is halachically the most significant point at the very end, or the whole time is a ma'aseh shchita. So we said it's negeya if you begin shechting outside of the azara, then you go inside. So part of the shchita is outside the azara, but the ma'aseh shchita b'soif is inside the azara. So the Gemara has the following. It's a long shaila, and you need to go all the way to the end, but just a little bit background to understand the shaila better. The halacha is, you need to know a couple things. One is there's a law in the Torah that you're not allowed to shech the carbon Pesach while owning chametz. That's Erev Pesach. According to Rav Shimon, one of the Tanoim, there's a lav throughout Pesach shechting any other kosher carbon. So let's say you bring the Shalmei Chagiga, middle Chol Moed, you're also going to be over a lav. But number 3, there's only a lav if you bring a kosher carbon. If you bring a puzzle carbon, then there's no lav. You'll be over a lav because you're only chametz, but you're not going to be over a lav for lisishchar al chametz dam zivchi. And fourth thing to know is that a carbon Pesach throughout the year turns into a shlamim. Okay, so let's begin. Maser v'dibaravin ubemoyed on cholamoyed. If you bring a carbon Pesach, now why are you bringing carbon Pesach cholamoyed? So Pasha Pshat is the case is where you lost the carbon Pesach, replaced it, found the original, so now you have 2. So one you brought an Erev Pesach, and one you bring a Middle Chol Moed. Now what you should do is you should bring that as a shlamim, but you brought it as a carbon Pesach. So Potter, while owning chametz, you're not going to be chayev for owning chametz because it's a puzzle carbon. A carbon Pesach on Chol Moed is not a carbon Pesach; it's puzzle. Shaloi l'shmai, but if you dafka think that it's going to be a shlamim and chayev, then it's a kosher carbon, then you're chayev for owning chametz. Okay, that's a mishnah. V'avinam in the Gemara over there asked, Taima d'shaloi l'shma hastama Potter. It sounds like it's only a kosher carbon and you're chayev for owning chametz because it's a kosher carbon dafka. If you thought that it's a shlamim, but stam, if you bring in a chol moed stam without thinking, Potter. V'amai Potter. So, meaning, Potter, it's not considered a kosher carbon. The stam thought on Pesach is that this is a carbon Pesach, even though it's not able to be brought then. The stam thought, unless you think shlamim, we assume it's a Pesach. V'amai Potter, but why? Pesach b'shayi ma'aseh shlamim hu. Isn't a Pesach after Erev Pesach automatically a shlamim? So why over here do we assume that it's a carbon Pesach until you think shlamim? So Shema Mina, the Gemara attempts to conclude from here, Pesach b'shayi ma'aseh hashana bo yakira. That a carbon Pesach throughout the year is a carbon Pesach, and you have to actively think shlam. Meaning, it's not that the second carbon Erev Pesach is over, it automatically shifts to a shlam. It's a carbon Pesach until you think otherwise. That's the conclusion the Gemara makes. All of this is part of the Havamina to get to what's relevant. Rav Chibar Gamder said no. Chazal explained that no. Really, a carbon Pesach throughout the year is automatically a shlam because it's not eligible anymore. Over here, it's a different case. Over here, we're talking about the following case. Normally, after Erev Pesach, it automatically goes to Shalom because it's not eligible anymore. This case specifically, it's still eligible. How could it be still eligible? It's after Erev Pesach. The case is not where you lost the carbon Pesach and found a replacement. The case was, Shayubailim Tami Meis. It's the original carbon. But in Erev Pesach, you were Tami. So what happens with that carbon Pesach? The carbon Pesach is used for Pesach Sheni. So therefore, it's still eligible as a carbon Pesach, meaning normally the second Erev Pesach is over. It's no longer eligible as a carbon Pesach, it automatically converts to a shlamim, but over here it remains eligible as a carbon Pesach because you use it for Pesach Sheni. That's the Gemara's conclusion. Okay. Fine. What does that have to do with our discussion? So you see that this animal, because it's still eligible for a carbon Pesach Sheni, it remains a carbon Pesach until you actively think otherwise. Kasha is as follows. What does it have to do with whether a shchita is metchilas avad soifa? This is the only hard part of the daf. Whether it's a shchita metchilas avad soifa or only b'soif. So Gemara says, and I shech this carbon Pesach. Again, I shech this on Chol Moed thinking it's a carbon Pesach. Or just thinking stam, so that's assumed carbon Pesach because it's eligible for Pesach Sheni. The Gemara says, I understand if you believe yesh l'shchita metchila v'tsoif, that the shchita is from beginning to end, which means from the beginning to end, it's considered a ma'aseh shchita in order to make it ineligible to make problems. In this case, I have this carbon Pesach, it's a middle Chol Moed, but because it can be used for Pesach Sheni, and when I start shechting it, I think it's going to be used for, it's still eligible. The second I start cutting, I'm thinking Karban Pesach, still eligible. I own chametz. That's the halacha. If saleh b'tchila shchita, so the second you start cutting, now it's a Karban Pesach that you're shechting choma. It is not eligible, so that's going to be possible. But if you believe that the ikar shchita is at the end, so then here's the point: it should automatically shift to a shlamim. Why would it shift to a shlamim? The whole reason why it's a Karban Pesach is because it's eligible for Pesach Sheni. But the second you start cutting, you cut the first 75%. The only thing that's a real Maisa Shchita, the real halachic Shchita, is the 75%, right? That end of it. The first part is just making the animal, sort of just like slowly killing the animal. At that point, is it still eligible for Pesach Sheni? No, it's not going to survive that long. So if you want to say that it's an entire Maisa Shchita, so the second you start cutting, because you're thinking Karban Pesach, it's already not an eligible carbon, fine. But if you're telling me that the Iker Maisa Shchita at the end, so at the end it's no longer eligible for Pesach Sheni because you already started, its neck is already cut. So automatically when you start cutting it, it should automatically convert to a Shlomim. And then at the end, the Maisa Shchita is Nikva at the end. At the end, don't tell me it's eligible for Pesach Sheni. It's not going to survive to Pesach Sheni. So what's the answer? The whole reason why it's a Karban Pesach is because it's eligible for Pesach Sheni. It's not eligible for Pesach Sheni anymore. At that point, when you're deciding at the very end, is this a Maisa Shchita? At that point, it's not eligible for Pesach Sheni. It must be a Shlamim at that point. So it should be Chaya for only Chametz. But if you tell me that it's only eligible, the end of the Maisa Shchita is the Iker, so at that point, you have to ask yourself, right? You have to ask yourself, is this eligible for a Karban Pesach? If not, it's going to automatically convert to a Shlamim. At the end of it, it's not eligible anymore because it's not going to live to Pesach Sheni. So how could I use this for Pesach Sheni? It's going to die. Even the Shachab Apurta, Itchalei me Pesach. Ido kikar shachar shlamim kashachar. The whole reason why it's not treated as a shlamim is because it's not eligible. It's going to be eligible for Pesach Sheni, but not by the time you get to the end of the shechita, it's not going to survive that long. So the Gemara says, you're right, it won't survive that long, but it's still eligible for Pesach Sheni. Why? Because I could sell it. At that moment, at the very end, right as it's about to be shechted, as it's about to die, I could sell it and buy the proceeds and use the proceeds for a Pesach Sheni. So it's still eligible for Pesach Sheni. It's still eligible for money. Now, how are you going to sell it at that point? To sell a carbon, you have to be able to stand it in the market. It has to be able to stand up. It's going to fall over. So when I said, even if you shech the majority of the pipes, as long as it's still jerking around, you could still sell it. So because at that moment it's still eligible to be sold, it's still in a way eligible for Pesach Sheni, and that's why it's not a Shlomim. But normally, the Karban Pesach, after Erev Pesach, it automatically becomes a Shlomim. Okay. It's the end of that discussion. The rest of the daf is a lot easier. Let's say you shecht the pipes in 3 different places. The way Rashi explains, I shecht the top of the pipes 30% through, then I go to the middle 90% through, then I go to the bottom 30% through. So the middle is a kosher shchita, the top and the bottom are not. So the halacha is shchita kosher. It's still kosher because at least you got the middle 90%. So Amar Li, to that Rav said to Rabbi Yehuda, be'inyan shchita mefaras, the place of the incision has to be clear. In other words, it has to be that you could open it up clearly. What does that mean for this discussion? So the concern is that the top cut and the bottom cut will expand naturally, closing up the middle cut. So the middle cut won't be as visible. So because while you did cut the middle 90%, but because you cut above it and below it, people may not notice the middle incision is not clear, and it has to be a clear incision. So he feels that it's a problem. Okay, the Gemara will discuss this. Rish Lakish also agrees with Rav that it has to be a clear incision. How do I know the incision point has to be discernible? The pasuk says their tongue is like a sharpened arrow, and it speaks lies, meaning that the pasuk describes the cutting of the area of the shechita is like an arrow. Arrows cut clearly, so too it has to be a clear cut. Okay. So Masiv Rav Elazar says, wait a minute, doesn't the Mishnah say Shnayim oichazim besakin b'sheichtin afilu echad milmayla ve'echad milmata shchitas ukshera? Now the Mishnah says 2 people can shecht an animal at the same time. Now Pashtus, we're talking about where I'm holding a knife on the top, you're holding a knife on the bottom, separate knives, and I'm cutting and you're cutting. And you see that even though each incision is not going to be discernible because the other incision point is going to sort of get in the way, it's still kosher. So it doesn't have to be discernible. Over here you're having multiple lacerations because I'm cutting on the top, you're cutting on the bottom. So the Gemara says, no, Amarli Rav Yirmiyah, Mishnasenu, B'sakin Echa B'Shem Yodim. No. The case is not where two knives. Really, you're not allowed to use two knives because it has to be a clear incision point. The case is where we're both holding one knife. And the chiddush of the Mishnah is that we're able to cut it at the same time, and we're not going to I'm not going to take away from you, and you're not going to take away from me. So it's not that you're cutting multiple knives; it's two people holding one knife. Says the Gemara. Wait a minute, I'll just say it's also see inside. The problem is the Brisa clarifies what's the chiddush. Again, the Mishnah says two people cutting is kosher. We thought at first it means two people with two different knives, and the chiddush is okay. We'll see the chiddush in a minute. I guess the chiddush is we'll get to chiddush in a minute. Now you're saying no. The case is where it's two people holding one knife. Two people holding two knives is a problem, because it's not a clear incision point. Here's the problem. The Brisa says, what's the chiddush? Or whatever the case is, two knives, one knife. The Brisa says, the chiddush is, I might think that it's a treifa, kamash malan. Now, if there's two knives, I get the chiddush. I'm cutting and you're cutting. The chiddush is that you might think that because I'm cutting, you'll rely on me to cut roiv and you really cut less than roiv, and vice versa. So, I mean, because you got two people, too many chefs in the kitchen. Meaning you might think that each one is not going to cut roiv. Kamash malan, it's a kosher shchita. But if you're telling me that it's two people with one knife, what's the concern here? The main concern is that when I'm pulling, you're pushing, and it ends up that instead of pulling at the same time, we're actually pushing down. That's a psul. You're not allowed to push. That's called drasa. Pushing, pressing down is a psul. So why does the Brisa say that the chiddush is that it's not a treifa, that we cut it properly? It should say the chiddush is that it's not a drisa, that it's not a hadrasa. Because if you tell me it's one knife, then the ikar chiddush is that we're not pressing down on the neck. So it says the Gemara, Hainu D'Tanyala. Wait a minute, what does the Brisa say? That while they're cutting, we're not concerned it's going to be a treifa. Now, if you tell me that it's two knives, Shapir, I get that would be a concern that the Brisa is saying is not a concern. Meaning, the same you might think that I'm relying on you to shecht roiv, and you're relying on me to shech roiv, and neither of us shech roiv. To that, the Mishnah says no, we're not choishin. But if you're telling me that it's a case of one knife and two people, so the concern is not that we're not going to cut the roiv of the pipes. The concern is that we're going to push down. The concern is that when I'm pulling, you're pushing. I'm pulling, you're pulling, and it ends up pushing. It should say that we're not concerned that there's drisa. So I'm Rav and Tani. Go to the next page. So change the lashon. That's what it means. Really, it's one knife. And it should read that we're not concerned that you're going to push down. Rav Oven as a kasha, again, we're asking a kasha on the shittas that hold that you're able to lacerate the knife in the neck in multiple places, even though it's not going to be clear. The Brisa says shachas aveshel lamata. If you severed the esophagus below, vesakana lamaila, and the trachea above. Now this kind of sounds like you cut the esophagus below and the trachea above, multiple lacerations. It's kosher. But it's not clear. So you see that it doesn't have to be clear because it's multiple lacerations. So he explains, no, the case is where you cut at an angle. It's one laceration, but it's going downward as an angle. So it's not cutting the trachea and the esophagus in the same location. It's not multiple lacerations, it's one laceration. Could be multiple lacerations. Taka would not be a kosher shchita. There was an ox that was cut in 2 or 3 places. Mamash our discussion. He took the best part of the meat and ate it. So Amir of Zera, meaning he felt that you got multiple lacerations. Means you don't need a mefuras, you don't need a shchita that's clear incision, which means that when the Mishnah says it's kosher, it could be even 2 people holding 2 knives. So he said to him, Amr Rav Zera said, Rabbeinu, from your actions, it's clear that when the Mishnah is mater, it doesn't have to be 2 people with 1 knife. It could be even 2 people and multiple knives because you could have multiple lacerations. Okay, one of the psulim of shchita is called hachlada. Hachlada means that you bury the knife beneath the pipes and then pull out, going from the neck forward, meaning from the neck bone forward. If you bury the knife between the pipes, upasku, and then you cut the pipes, psula, that's called hachlada. It's a classic hachlada. But tachas. But if you put the knife beneath the skin and then cut, even though the knife is covered by the skin, it's not covered by simonim. That's not called hachlada. Kshera. That it's only a problem when it's covered. It doesn't mean the knife can be covered like with a shield. It's that it can't be buried in between the pipes. Okay. It's called hachlada. The kasha is, don't we already know this? Mak mashalon. Tanina, we have a Mishnah. The Mishnah said beforish. If you take the knife and bury it between the pipes and then you cut it, mamish our case, Rabbi Sheva amr nevela or Akiva amr treifa. It's machlekes whether it's a nevela or a treifa. Okay, aber it's clearly a problem. So why are you telling me it's a problem? I already know it's a problem. The Mishnah is a problem. So the Gemara says, Imas nisan hava mina hani mila malamata lamala. The Chiddush of the Mishnah, the reason why it has to say it twice, because in both cases you're putting the knife in between the pipes. The question is, which direction are you then cutting? I would think, if I only said it once, the Mishnah just said it puzzle, I would think that that's where you're cutting towards the back of the neck. I'm sorry, where you're going towards the front of the neck, so you're actually cutting upwards. So that's not a normal way to cut. But if you were to bury the knife in and then saw down, in the normal Maisa Shchita, just instead of cutting at the beginning of the neck, you're cutting by your starting point is between the pipes, maybe that's okay, because at least the motion of the knife is the same. Kamash Malan, in both cases, it's going to be a problem. Now, we said before that if you bury the knife beneath the skin and then cut, it's kosher. Tachzar Shera. Beirav says, Tachzar any day. He says, I'm not sure. He wasn't sure if that's kosher. And it could be he felt that the knife has to be uncovered when you begin to cut. So they asked this question further. According to Beirav, what if there's a cloth, meaning you take the knife and you cover with a cloth and then cut. So the knife is not in the animal, but it's not revealed also. Is that achlada? Or tachas semer mesubach? Let's say the animal has a lot of hair, and it's got a wool, and you put the knife in, so you don't really see the knife. It's not really covered by anything. It's covered by the wool. Teiku, not sure. Another kasha. Let's say you cut roiv simanim, and then you quickly put the knife in the other side and do the miyat simanim by hachlada. So you do the miyat of the simanim. Do you say that roiv simanim is already cut? Doesn't matter. You say no. Any of the shchita cannot be done when the knife is covered. Mahu teku. Okay. New Mishnah. Hashoichet shnei rashin ke'echad. We had this in the previous Mishnah, which is that if you shech two animals right next to each other, shchita sukshera, it's kosher b'diavad. This is talking about karbanos, because tiz b'cheyu ksiv, that means that each carbon should be cut separately. Shnaim oichsim b'sakin v'sheichtim, if two people are holding a knife, which we said previously is either one knife or two knives, it's kosher. Afilech l'mala v'ech l'mata. Shchita sukshera. Hittis is a rosh v'asachas. Now this is called hadrasa, which means, this is what we said before, instead of cutting in the cutting motion, you just push down, chop, psula, it's puzzle. Let's say you cut the animal without going back and forth, you just go one direction. So the question is that considered a maisa shchita or is that pressing down? So we say, if the knife is longer, it's like two necks worth. So then by you pushing forward, the knife is so long that you could actually cut both pipes without pressing down, then it's kosher. But if not, if the knife is not long enough, then the only way to cut it properly, the only way to cut it fully, if the knife is short, is by pressing down, unless you go back and forth. So let's say I shech two animals next to each other. I have to make sure the knife, without it just going one direction, so I have to make sure the knife is now one neck's worth bigger than both of them. Meaning it's got to be three necks worth, because again, it has to be able to glide farther enough to cut it without going back and forth. This whole thing that the knife has to be long is only if you're cutting in one direction. But if you're sewing back and forth, a proper shchita, then the knife could be even very small. It could be a scalpel, because you're going back and forth. So it doesn't really matter, as long as there's a blade. If you're going in one direction only, then the knife has to be long enough. How do I know that chopping or chopping hadrasa is a problem? We had this before, that the tongue is like a sharpened arrow, and the arrows, when they cut, it doesn't press, it cuts through. So that's how the shchita must be done as well. Tan Rabbi Shmuel, a different source, v'shachat. The pasuk says you shall shachat. Shachat. He's translating as ein b'shachat elo moshach. B'shachat means to draw, meaning to go back and forth. V'cheinu omer, and we find a similar pasuk that says zahuv shachut, drawn out gold. Meaning that you take gold and you sort of pull it. So it means to drawn out gold. So you see shachat can mean drawn out. V'omer, in a third source, chet shach l'shayna mir medibra. That's the case we had before. My v'omer, why is it necessary to have this other sources? V'chi tema zahav shachut shenitva b'chutu. Maybe zahav shachut does not mean gold that is drawn, but rather gold that's spun. And maybe shachut means to spin, and not to draw back and forth. Tashema chet shachut l'shayna. Okay, just to end off, Rabbi have a badik legira. Rabbi checked an arrow and make sure it was sharp. And he shot the bird while it was flying. He hit it in the neck, and he shech the bird with an arrow. So the Gemara says, "V'dilmad avid chalada." But why aren't you concerned that the arrow pushed in? Meaning hachlada. I'm sorry, hachlada means to burrow. Meaning that we said before that you have to cut. You can't go in the neck outwards. It has to go at the front of the neck. You can't burrow in. So it only is good if you cut the skin of the neck. If you go through the neck, then that's a problem of achlada. So how did he know that the arrow didn't do this? So the Gemara says Chazina, and he examined Gidfei de Parmi. He saw that the feathers were sliced, which means that the arrow cut the actual neck skin. Now the Gemara has one last kasha. He killed the bird this way. Now one of the mitzvahs of when you shech the bird is you have to do kisei adam. If the bird's flying in the air, how do you shecht it that way? What about kisei adam? Haboy kisoi. So you say, okay, well, he sees where it's splattered, he covered it. The problem is you have to put dirt below the blood, right? You take the chicken, you put dirt, shech the chicken, and put more dirt. So if he shechs a bird flying in a field, even if he covers the blood with dirt, he's got to put dirt before that. You have to put dirt below and above. It has to be in dirt, meaning you have to put dirt below and above. So how did he do this? The Gemara says, he put dirt all over the area that the birds were going to fly. I guess it was like hunting. He knew they were going to fly in this field. He covered the field with dirt, then hit it, then hit it with the arrow, and then so it's now on dirt, and then he covered it with dirt further. I'll stop here.